Welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar, IDV Essentials, Customer Experience and Risk Management, brought to you by Mitek. As the volume of online and mobile transactions continues to grow, the ability to quickly and accurately identify customers has become essential to businesses across the globe. The dual considerations of limiting friction to create a high-quality customer experience while still managing risk may often seem at odds, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Joining us today to help address these challenging questions are two of the industry's most knowledgeable veterans. Steve Craig, Mitek's Director of Product, leads product and user experience strategy for Mitek's global identity business and has over a decade of experience in fintech, delivering software as a service and mobile solutions for Digital Insight, Intuit, and Hewlett-Packard. Also joining us is Sarah Clark, a principal with OWI, an independent advisory and digital strategy consultancy focused on trust and the data economy. Previously as Senior Vice President at Mitek, Sarah has established herself as one of the world's leading experts in mobile identity verification and onboarding. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, all. I'm Steve Craig at Mitek. It's probably clear to everyone on the webinar today that we're in the middle of a digital identity crisis. Trust is tanking, and identity verification is taking center stage. The Wall Street Journal reported millions of credit applicants probably don't exist. This is synthetic identity fraud, and it's running rampant. TechCrunch reported about Facebook's issues with the number of individuals that are creating fake pages. They've now started a process of identifying ad buyers through identity verification. We're all probably familiar, too, with the crisis around Facebook and last year's election fake news stories. Facebook has been under pressure for issues related to individuals creating fake news topics and circulating it, so much that even Zuckerberg was required to speak before a U.S. Senate to talk about the issue. VentureBeat reported that there are expanding efforts to verify accounts on Twitter, because Twitter is also a source of a lot of fake news. And finally, Al Pasquale of Javelin Research has noted the impacts of record rates of growth in identity fraud. It's clearly a hot topic, and all of this news coverage converges to a few market drivers. So we're seeing regulation trends. So the increases in anti-terrorism and anti-money laundering are changing regulatory dynamics across financial services and in many different countries. At the same time, we're continuing to see digital transformation as mobile and digital become paramount in commerce. Most people are trying to transact these days via their smartphone or through their computer.
With all of these market drivers, Mitek recently connected with Zogby Analytics. Mitek commissioned a study. There were about 1,100 digital users that were analyzed, and what we found that about 85% of those consumers are much more likely to interact with websites that have had some sort of seal of approval or some indicator that the identities of those that they're interacting with have been confirmed versus sites that don't do this. It's been a very important step for these companies in ensuring trust and safety across their user base. We've got a couple of polling questions. So Cameron, if you want to initiate the poll, we want to run those through. We want to give people a few moments to answer those polls, and we have some data that we're going to go through with you. First question is, what is most important when doing business online? The second is, if a website could make sure, guarantee that a person is who they claim to be, how would you feel about engaging more with their website? Have you had an anonymous online profile pretending to be someone else? Please answer honestly. Do you think it's too easy to create a fake profile on social media? And finally, for online in-home services, would you select a company that verified the identity of the service providers over one that does not? All right. Thank you. So we're going to review some of those results later, but before we do that, we'll get into the content from the Zogby study. So here are our responses from the around 1,100 individuals that we polled. You can see that overwhelmingly, these folks would be much more likely to do business with them if they knew the buyers and sellers were legitimate. The next question. Have you ever had an anonymous online profile or pretended online to be someone else than you really are? So we have a much smaller portion saying yes, but there is a high number of people that believe that there are quite a few fake profiles, either bots or accounts created on social media that aren't exact representations of those individuals. Next question. For websites that offer in-home services like dog walking, home repairs, etc., how likely are you to select a company that does a verification over one that does not? Overwhelmingly, yes. This goes back to the trust and safety issue. It's really important to ensure that if you're going to invite someone to walk your dog or into your home to do a repair, you really want to make sure that you know who that individual is. So with all of these trends, some of the key drivers we see on the buy side for those that are looking to implement these technologies, one, there is overwhelming demand from consumers and brands for digital mobile onboarding experiences and transactions. With that, there's also demand and desire to increase revenue in those digital channels. But with that comes quite a few challenges. First, as we know, knowledge-based authentication, which uses primarily credit bureau data, has its challenges. That data can easily be accessed through breaches or the dark web. We're also seeing with the implementation of EMV in the US, that we're seeing more application fraud rates. It's not so easy to complete card-not-present transactions with EMV, so we're seeing that trend grow. There's been a lot of growth in identity fraud, both in the impersonation and synthetic area. And then the regulations are getting stricter, so compliance requirements around know your customer, anti-money laundering. And with all these steps that need to be put in place, there is an increase in abandonment rate. So some consumers are unable to get through some of these checks. Let's say KVA, for example, if they don't answer correctly, they fall out of that process. Whereas maybe a fraudster is able to answer those questions more quickly because they have the data right in front of them. So how do you build trust and rebuild that trust? Well, the opportunity is even greater than before. So as we all know, mobile has exploded. It has become a self-service channel for most industries. Most of your target consumers have a mobile device, a smartphone device, and many of them are updating them on a frequent cadence. The knowledge-based authentication, as I mentioned before, is increasingly ineffective. It creates friction. As people do not respond to those questions correctly, they drop out of that process. So at Mitek, one of our areas of focus is identity document verification through the mobile device. And identity documents are the most powerful documents you have in your wallet. So they represent who you are, what accounts you can access, and they represent you as a transactor. So it's very important to combine the two things that a user has, the smartphone, which they're carrying with them constantly, along with the most powerful thing in their wallet, the identity document. But we don't want to have a solution that's just looking for a problem. There needs to be really apparent friction. If you look at reasons to use this type of technology, you have to look at the alternatives. So we talked first about the data from credit bureaus. That's getting to be more and more of a problem, especially with all the credit bureaus having some sort of breach. And even major retailers who have a lot of data on consumers, many of them have also had their own data breaches. Face-to-face interactions has long been the best way, but that is really inconvenient for your consumer. Going into a branch or a retail location to prove identity, especially if you've only got certain business hours or if your office locations aren't accessible, creates a lot of unnecessary friction. Third, if you are trying to reach a target demographic that has not adapted to credit profiling, I mean, they have not created accounts or perhaps they're just starting that, you can't reach them. If they're not banked, if they have not had that established credit history or account history, then you wouldn't be able to access them. And then overall, knowledge-based authentication, both from the data that's coming off of credit bureaus to the ones that people respond to, like what was their street when they grew up on, those data elements can easily be spoofed by a fraudster. But if we're going to look at identity documents and using a smartphone camera to be able to capture those, one of the most important challenges that we've seen goes all the way back to Mitek's heritage in mobile deposit, that image quality and image capture is very important. So not all image capture is created equal. Just taking a picture, whether it be a selfie or friends and family, is fine. But when you're trying to capture a document, there's a lot that can go wrong with that. First of all, background interactions. If you have something in the background that is creating noise with the document, that makes it really challenging to analyze it. The security of the capture itself is important. When you're dealing in multiple languages, dealing with multiple regions, having localization is important as well. But as the user is capturing the document, there are other elements. So one of the things that Mitek has implemented is real-time guidance to be able to assist the user with making sure that there's sufficient brightness and contrast on the document, that there are no glare spots, and ultimately taking that picture so that it can be fully verified and processed. Mitek has a suite of technology for that, and we find in this ecosystem with all identity verification providers, this is very important to the process. Once you have a high quality image capture, the next step is to really ensure that the document itself is authentic. So just like when you go through airport security and the TSA line, there are characteristics of every document that need to be evaluated to make sure that it's really a legitimate, authentic, and valid document. So the structure is the first indicator, but at scale, it's very hard to analyze the structure of documents across the multiple states that all have their different layouts. So it's certainly not an easy task for someone manually to do this, like a teller or even the TSA agents themselves. You really need a technology that can evaluate that at speed. But there's other elements in the document. The biographical data that's on the document is actually cross-referenced with a barcode that's on the back of the document, the PDF 417 format. There are embedded security features that are used to ensure that it can't physically be tampered, but those can also be used in a computer vision technique in an automated process. The portrait, probably one of the most important things on the document so that you can tie that person back to the person standing in front of you, is also critical. And there are security features that are layered into those portraits as well. And being able to extract a high quality picture from that portrait is key in the process of marrying it back to the user, especially with the automated capture of the face. Signature and other elements of the document can also be telltale signs that it's been tampered. We notice a fairly large percentage of fake documents may include no signature, which typically would not be allowed by an issuing authority, or it could be a signature that has been written in some kind of font because the individual creating the tamper or the fake is trying to trick it. So these are very important elements to that process. Now, from a customer experience, we talked about some of the alternatives, which are very high friction, but in the digital channel, there are different ways that a consumer can interact. Primarily, you're going to see the smartphone, but it could be a desktop, it could be a laptop. Making sure that the user has a mechanism across those is key. So the native app, the actual downloaded app, has the most powerful capability in terms of access to the device's hardware, but many users choose to just interact in a browser session. So being able to support mobile web, which is typically in Safari or Chrome, is key. We find that many customers in this space have also implemented desktop to mobile, and that is where an interaction may begin in a desktop or a laptop, but at the same time, that user or that consumer has their smartphone right next to them. So creating a handoff experience, whether it be through a text message or a QR code or some other means, is important. And then lastly, if you do have someone who can make it into a location, whether it be a branch or a retail storefront, having technology for the associates there to be able to do the same process is key, so that there's no gap where a fraudster or someone who's trying to trick the system goes to one of the channels in order to get past an identity check. We find for many of the customers we have in this space, they're using that as a mechanism to create that overall omni-channel experience. Finally, for my talk, customer experience best practices. Talk a little bit about the friction. We talked a bit about the channel, omni-channel. But overall, you want to have a holistic approach. You want to be able to support consistency across the various channels. You don't want to create opportunities where you have a mismatch in how the consumer is interacting with you. Real-time feedback is also key, not just in the acquisition of images for this process, but also the response time back. So we focus on the Mitek platform in as near real-time processing as possible, so the document and the results can be returned back to our customer and they can continue the workflow in the transaction. Robust authentication is also important. So just the breadth across the U.S. of the various states is a challenge, but every one of those states, there's significant depth required in evaluating those documents. We talked about omni-channel, and we also think it's very important from the IDV perspective to ensure you're bridging that gap from the physical and digital world. So people interact in various ways, whether it's calling into a call center or in the retail location. You want to make sure that that is as seamless to them as possible. You want to make sure your brand experience is all tied together from the physical location to the digital experience and the mobile app. Each of these things all should weigh into consideration on the types of technologies you select and how you pull the pieces together for your solution. So with that said, I want to pass it over to Sarah, and she's going to talk about some additional considerations in this area.
Thank you, Steve. Before I get into the contents of this slide, I want to echo a couple of important points that Steve made during his portion. The first is, and I think this is once again illustrated really nicely through the recent Zogby survey that Mitek conducted, which I know they'll be publishing, I think, very soon in its entirety. But the first is that identity verification, or stronger identity verification, really is the key to continued growth in the digital economy. We've seen for a couple years now customer sentiment continuing to strengthen on this issue. There have been past surveys that have also shown folks are sitting out of all sorts of experiences that they would like to have digitally, sharing economy offerings and such, because they don't have trust in the identity verification of the platform. So it's imperative for customer acquisition and for continued growth to strengthen that as part of your product if you have any sort of digital offering. But I want to flip the conversation a bit from customer experience related topics, which I thought Steve covered quite well, to risk related topics. And some of this is overlap, of course, but let's get a bit more into the risk to your business of not pursuing the latest and greatest with respect to digital identity verification. And I've seen this term weaponized used a few times in recent weeks. The New York Times recently published an article about behavioral biometrics, and I found this to be a very just interesting term that was used that I feel is dramatic yet very appropriate, because this is really the climate that we find ourselves in, and that's one where identity is being weaponized. Fraud around identity is booming. The Better Identity Coalition recently published a report looking at identity fraud in 2017. And I did round the number up, admittedly. I think their actual number was 16.8 billion. So 17 billion essentially of known US dollars lost in 2017 due to identity fraud. This is known fraud and known losses. So in actuality, when you think about synthetic identity and the lack of a victim, the number could be considerably larger. That's staggering, and I think should give us all pause. And it's also a number that's been growing. Steve mentioned data breaches, and I think everyone who's tuned into this webinar is probably well aware of the problem of data breaches. But it's really worth, I think, quantifying that, because again, it's quite staggering. If you were to average out the number of PII records, or personally identifiable information records, that are breached on average a day, it's 7 million. If you look at the number of individuals in the United States that are known to have been affected by a breach in 2017, that's 171 million people. Our population, including children, right, is had over 300 million. So it's really the vast majority of US adults have been impacted. Your data is breached, your data is known, and the concept of just using points of data to verify that you are who you say you are is dead. I mean, it's ineffective, and that we need to move away from that quickly, and the market is moving away from that quickly. But when we talk about weaponized, what does that mean? So your data is on the dark web. It's being purchased en masse by people who intend to perpetrate fraud. And how do they do that? Well, one method that they use is they take these found points of data and they cycle through various digital offerings with bots, trying to test and use it, trying to see where you've reused the same password, trying to see where the same PII can be used to open accounts. ThreatMetrics recently published a cybercrime report, and they have a fairly comprehensive view into the volume of fraud, but their view is still partial. And in their report, they detected 2.6 billion known bot attacks in the first half of 2018. And again, this is a partial view of the problem. Again, that's a staggering number and gives insight into how this breached data is really being used to attack digital offerings across financial services and marketplaces sharing, you name it, e-commerce. Account opening specifically, we've seen over the years as a target that has continued to rise in importance to fraudsters. So it used to be, and Steve touched on this, the credit card info was used, and that using credit card accounts fraudulently was the main attack vector. That's really shifted, and account opening is a primary target. Attack rates on digital account opening user experiences can be as high as 24%. So 24% is applicable to e-commerce, to marketplaces, to sharing economy account opening offerings. In financial services, the number is a bit lower. I think the average is about 12% across all types of account openings. But when your average is more than 1 out of 10 is a fraud attack, that's, again, a very staggering number. Synthetic identity fraud continues to rise. So I think most listeners probably understand what synthetic identity is, but just as a brief summary, it's using a valid social security number in conjunction with other real and fake data to create an identity that sort of partially but not really exists. So in the world of identity fraud, we have 16.7 million victims, with synthetic identity tactics continuing to rise. And then adjacent to all of this, and really interesting, you see these innovations and fraud techniques that are both fascinating as well as frightening. Deep fakes are something that has been getting some interesting media attention. And this, really is interesting in the context of some of the social media fraud that we've been seeing. So a deep fake is where you can create the appearance of someone who is on video saying something that they may never have said. And these video attacks are extremely realistic and extremely frightening in the age that we live in of fake news, but also represent an interesting attack vector on facial biometrics. So this is a handful of examples of how identity is becoming weaponized. And it's really, when you look at it in its entirety, it's a major call to action for anyone who has a digital platform where trust and identity are important, that it's imperative to upgrade to the latest and greatest in terms of best practices in identity verification. So let's go on to the next slide. Not all doom and gloom. There are technologies that can help strengthen your product significantly. So what are some of the best practices to reduce risk, to combat being a victim as a business of this heightened digital identity fraud, and to also address, many of the points that Steve made around customer experience and expectations, low friction, et cetera. So first and foremost, this is, I think, obvious at this point in time, but bears repeating. Your identity proofing must go beyond the regulations. So on one hand, the regulations are strengthening, and we see that they're becoming inclusive of more and more use cases. This is something that happens at a different cadence in different countries, but ultimately FATF is a global organization that makes recommendations that tend to flow through to the different countries and jurisdictions. So regulations are becoming more broad in terms of requiring identity verification or know your customer on a broader number of use cases. But on the other hand, they've really fallen behind in the sense that the most common interpretation in the US of KYC regulations is you must triangulate the social security number, date of birth, and name, and that's sufficient. That is not sufficient. That's something that maybe still needs to be done, but your identity proofing certainly cannot consist only of that step at this point in time. And if it does, it needs to be upgraded. So how do you upgrade it? Government issued ID capture and selfie capture are really a great solution for putting into any trusted platform, from financial services to sharing economy and beyond. And there are a few reasons for this. I think Steve went through a lot of that, so I won't belabor many of them, but linking it back to synthetic identities, government-issued IDs are one of the best ways to combat the problem of synthetic identity fraud. And also having this user experience at your front door itself is just a deterrent to much of the risk of digital fraud. A fraudster will generally flow through to the path of least resistance. And if you have this type of check up front, your platform at this point in time will not be one of those paths of least resistance. So for trusted accounts, for financial services, it probably makes sense to put the, quote, friction of capturing an ID and a selfie as part of your front door. But on the flip side, you do want to choose friction wisely and at the right time. A risk-based approach is the right approach. So in some cases, you might want to choose a progressive, step up that may not happen right at your front door, but rather when your account holder chooses an action where they're going into that trusted realm. So you do want to think through when to place your ID capture and selfie capture. But in general, this technology as a whole across the market has really evolved We've seen some nice proof points in the market, and it's something that you should be looking at as part of a good solution. That said, that's not the only part of a robust solution that you should be looking at. Layers of dynamic checks are the key. That hasn't changed. So in a good risk-based approach, you ultimately want to have multiple layers as part of your stack. So what are some of those other layers? Steve mentioned growth in mobile. That's an understatement, especially when we look at account opening. At this point in time, we see about 60% across the market of accounts being opened from mobile devices. That's a huge number. And I remember just a couple of years ago, we were looking at numbers that were more like 10%. So that's risen quite quickly. And you can use a lot of the power of these mobile devices to layer in checks that include geolocation, that include a device reputation footprint, to see if that device generally has a good reputation or a bad reputation. So it's bifurcating your identity proofing from identity risk, and looking at those as two separate, related, but important signals. The other thing that I would recommend, given the bot issue, is behavioral biometrics. When you look at the way that a user is interacting with your account opening process, there are some technologies that have become quite mature with respect to being able to detect whether that is potentially a bot or is a real individual. And that brings me to the last point, which is continuous authentication. So we've been talking in market about account opening and login almost as if they're separate worlds in some cases. And it's traditionally been somewhat common for your customer acquisition team to be separate from the team that's handling the ongoing authentication of your users. That has started to change. A lot of the underlying technology that you would use in these stacks to make them more secure, you can actually use across both interactions. And it really is one problem set, because whether the user is new or whether the user is a repeat user, the problem is identifying that they are who they claim to be. So I would urge everyone to think of this as one problem and to look at ways that you can apply the same technology and products across both use cases and across your full customer journey. When you're looking at layering in behavioral biometrics and device reputation, oftentimes those can have the effect of removing friction from the various user journeys you have in your digital product. And when you look at government-issued ID capture and selfie capture, you can look at that as something that's important to strengthen your front door. And you can also look at that as something that you can use during a step-up for various other points of the user journey. So think of it as one problem, and think of it as how can you apply continuous authentication so that your new user enrollment is stamping the device and stamping the biometric at that time such that it can be used continuously so that you can have the most effective layers against digital fraud possible in place. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and let Cameron take the ball. I think he wants to open it up to see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. We have a few questions from the attendees. I'm just going to go ahead and throw a couple of these out there, and Steve and Sarah, feel free to tackle these as you see fit. Question one, how do you take consumer behaviors and how they interact with these different technologies into consideration when developing IDV approaches?
Great question. Sarah, do you want to?
How do you take consumer? I'm trying to kind of understand the spirit of the question. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. So consumer behaviors. I'm kind of assuming that question sort of is related to user experience and how you measure whether you're making your user experience better or worse when developing IDV approaches. So consumers obviously want the least amount of friction as possible. And I think developing an IDV approach has to come from two angles. One is to manage risk, obviously, and looking at, kind of the latest and greatest technologies to do so. But there's always friction with respect to the friction that an IDV product provides and allowing consumers to easily pass through the process. I'm not sure if I have a super canned answer for that because every business needs to look at their risk profile as it meets their business. Some will have more aversion to risk for legitimate reasons and therefore will intentionally want to make the process a bit harder for users to get through. And what I would say to that is, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Users are more aware, or I should say individuals are more aware than ever of some of the issues surrounding identity, the Facebook debacle, GDPR, some of these well-known, even data breaches are fairly well known around a wide swath of individuals. And therefore, people want the companies that they are signing up to do business with to keep them safe. So you may need to put friction in to keep your customers safe. That's okay, but you want to explain it to them and to be, always following product best practices when it comes to getting feedback, A/B testing, and being clear and transparent around why some of these steps exist. Transparency is really key. People have a bad taste in their mouth from some of the recent events that have happened. But on the flip side, they appreciate being protected. So if you're going to use some of these types of technologies, such as biometrics, et cetera, be very clear about the safety that it provides your customers, and also be very clear and also have a legitimate policy in place about data privacy and protection. Make it simple, make it clear, and I think that you're going to see the rewards of your customers appreciating that. Steve, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that covers it pretty well. And we've had a couple questions about the poll as well, about, we're curious what the overall result is. So Cameron, if I could interject here and just go over some of the poll results, that'd be all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's not an easy way to display this on the screen, so just have to imagine the questions again. So the first one we had asked was, what is most important to you when doing business online? Overwhelmingly with this audience, trusting the personal information is safe, making sure the information you provided. Close second was trusting that the business or person is who they claim to be. And then we did have a few responses around trusting reviews. I think reviews on products are really important. You don't want those to be fake. The next question was, if a website could make sure, guarantee that the person is who they claim to be, how would you feel about engaging more with their website? Overwhelmingly, a response there is more likely to do business. There's a few that responded that they would do about the same, and they would probably skip some research. More likely to do business lines pretty closely with the survey. Question number 3 was, have you ever had an anonymous online profile or pretended to be someone else? So lots of honesty here. This is 50-50 on the breakdown. So some of you have fake profiles. Maybe fake logins to the webinar too. Number 4, do you think it's too easy to create a fake profile on social media? 80% yes. No one said no. A couple people said maybe. So that's true. You really just need a phone number and an email with most of these sites to create a profile. And the last question for online in-home services, would you select a company that verified the identity of the service providers over one that does not? That was 100% yes. I think everyone on this audience panel today definitely wants those to be verified over someone who doesn't. That was the result. So Cameron, if you want to go back to some of the Q&A.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the questions that this is admittedly a question I am seeding as opposed to our audience. Still have a few more from the audience that I will also be including. One of the things that we've been seeing in the space is that for many digital first consumers, you know, your millennials, the folks who have really been used to using smartphones for a majority of their life, scanning an ID to enroll in a platform or application is not only not an additional burden, but almost a preferred method of interaction as opposed to a manual data entry on a mobile keyboard. Are you guys seeing that in the space as well from your clients, that in fact, you know, requiring an IDV check to take the place of a manual data entry is not only producing results on the risk side, but also increasing the throughput they get through their sales funnel?
Yes, exactly. Mitek has many customers that are doing two use cases with identity documents. One is a pre-fill scenario, as you mentioned. It can be much easier just to scan the back of the license. The barcode data has many of the elements that you would need to pre-fill a form during enrollment. We can also scan the front and do an OCR, an extraction of the data there. So that speeds up enrollment. It works especially well in native, where we can do a lot of the real-time scanning and extraction of the document. From the verified side, the nice benefit of doing that up front is you've then got benefit for the end user, the consumer, of easing the burden of getting the data in, but you now have pictures or data on the driver's license or ID that can be used for downstream verification. Of course, validating the document itself against the user's identity, consumer's identity, but also feeding into other systems and other processes that Sarah alluded to. So both use cases are very valid.
All right, next question. This one from the audience. How does GDPR affect the IDV process? Is this something that US-based and European-based companies both should be concerned with?
You want me to take that? Yeah, this is Sarah. I'll go ahead and take that one. So yes, GDPR is, of course, a European regulation. Without getting into the weeds of it, it is quite wide sweeping. So in general, US companies should be looking at that and have looked at that. If they haven't, they certainly should. But more broadly, GDPR is really the leading edge of a broader trend. Here in California, where I personally reside, we see similar legislation in play, and just sort of respecting growing sentiment of individuals or your customers. GDPR, I think, is a glimpse into really what should be best practices, whether you are regulated according to GDPR, having business with any individuals that are EU citizens or not. So how does GDPR impact identity verification? On one hand, it may not directly, but it really does impact how you ultimately store the PII or the identity information that your platform may house. And the way that I look at GDPR is as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to take a step back and ensure that as an organization, you understand every point of customer data that you're storing and where. What we find is that oftentimes that ends up kind of getting spread across an organization quite rapidly. And it's an opportunity to reconsolidate that and really think about your privacy principles, your commitment to your customer, and how to use that as something that can make your product more attractive to people that are increasingly more astute on these concepts. So it's an opportunity to consolidate your data. It's an opportunity to rethink your privacy principles. And it's also an opportunity to look at some technology that can offer benefits with respect to compliance and beyond. The concept of outsourcing, so to speak, some of the identity information to a digital identity provider is becoming more common. And like many other types of products, we saw that with credit cards, right? Credit card data became tokenized and rarely stored by many companies. And that's offered many benefits in terms of fraud, security, as well as the ability to focus on your core. So there's an emerging class of vendors that are digital identity providers that offer GDPR compliant solutions that can long-term really help your business overall. So just to recap, GDPR is an opportunity across a few different vectors.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. Following up in that similar compliance vein, another question from the audience. With third-party applications, who is ultimately responsible for compliance? So reading between the lines from our participants here, I think what they're asking is if you are, kind of purchasing some sort of white label app using some IDV technology that maybe isn't necessarily your company's, where do those compliance burdens fall?
Generally, from the Mitek perspective, those compliance burdens still fall on the ultimate institution who's transacting. So if you look at a bank and how they have KYC and AML processes, those banks are responsible for that compliance, and they will have audits come through. Companies like Mitek provide tools to make that process easier, but in many cases, those tools are parts of broader programs and other steps that might be handled. Some industries that don't quite have regulation, you ultimately see some of that liability still fall with those institutions if it comes from the cost side or worst case, if there's harm that comes to individuals in the trust and safety issue. So Mitek does its best to provide highly accurate, highly robust capabilities. But again, those just fall into bigger steps of that process.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, ultimately, if you're bound to regulations and compliance, it's your company's responsibility to adhere to that. And it's your choice to use a vendor for various aspects. But it's important, therefore, to really understand your vendors on that front and to ensure you incorporate third-party tools into your compliance and security testing. On the topic of data breaches, we've seen a trend recently where one of the vectors of successful attacks resulting in significant breach data has been third-party plugins to websites and mobile apps. I think there was a recent event where it was a customer service chat plugin that offered a vulnerability. So when you're selecting a vendor, be sure to ask them about their compliance and be sure to incorporate those third-party offerings into your vulnerability and compliance scanning processes.
Fantastic. Looks like we just got one more question. I think we'll consider this the last question before we hit the top of the hour here. From the chat, from Chelsea, if someone has recently moved or gotten married and looks like they have some personal information that doesn't necessarily match their photo ID, how do businesses kind of address those situations where maybe your ID doesn't necessarily match your underlying identity data?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this gets into the point of using layers again. Kind of a lengthy question, but I think what the attendee is asking is you might have an outdated ID and you might have newer information on record now, so how is that resolved? So earlier, I think we made the point that data is, quote, dead. Dead in terms of using it as the sole factor for identity verification. So what you know, what you have, who you are sort of the commonly bucketed factors for security and verification. Using only what you know has become much more challenging. It's certainly possible with the right layers of technology and the right risk profile to use that possibly as a starting point. I think that's very relevant in many number of cases. An ID document is a what you have factor, so it's inherently stepping up to be significantly stronger. But you don't ever want to use one factor on its own. So in this case, one way to solve for that is once again to look at the layers that your platform is utilizing. You can use ID scanning in conjunction with verifying from a data aggregator that uses a variety of sources, that those connections all make sense. And you probably do want to do that as an additional layer for any sort of ID fraud. So in this case, this type of connection can be made through a well-designed solution that brings data and IDs together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. I'm sorry, Steve, were you going to chime in there as well?
No, I think that was a great answer.
Wonderful. We got one, it looks like we have 3 minutes left. See if we can't squeeze a bit more information in here. I know it's already been jam-packed. Philip from the Q&A asked to take that last question one step farther in terms of liability. Should someone be misauthenticated, where does that responsibility lie? Is that ultimately with the responsibility of the institution seeking to, maintain that burden of IDV?
Generally, the answer to that, would be yes. There could be some identity product vendor in the space that maybe offers some form of liability protection. I think that's exceedingly rare. So the kind of canned answer to that question is yes, that would be the company who ultimately is onboarding that customer in the vast majority of cases.
Wonderful. And I would point out that, in my experience in the regulated industries such as banking, there is, regulators do to a certain degree apply a good faith standard to the extent if it was a fake ID that was so good that it passed, a well-known identity verification platform's automated IDV checks and the template was good enough that it passed all those scans and they still got through, I would find it hard to believe that you would really be, have the book thrown at you because of a super fake getting through your system. But that's a
absolutely. That's exactly true. I mean, generally there has to be very egregious, missing steps within the process for that to really be an issue with the regulator.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, Steve, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate all the information you've shared here today. Should any participants have any questions at the end of this that weren't touched on, please feel free to reach out to the contact email listed on the screen or to myself directly at One World Identity. Our contact information is available on our website as well. Thank you again for joining us, and look forward to another webinar coming up soon.